want to introduce to you now Deborah Lamb, who's going to join me up here. Deborah is going to be one of our lightning round presenters, but she's also one of our hosts. She's the Chief Innovation and Performance Officer for Mayor Peduto. He actually introduced her yesterday. She is one of the people who has become known around the country as a star member of Mayor Peduto's team. And what we're going to do today is going to go through some slides at our best attempt in a very short amount of time to summarize what happened yesterday, because we try to do takeaways. So we're going to begin with a quick summary of Mayor Peduto's presentation, and Deborah Lamb will do that for us. Deborah Lamb, give her a round of applause.
Thanks, Luke. Hello, everyone. Are you enjoying the conference so far? How were the site visits yesterday? Yeah, you got a chance to see Pittsburgh a little bit. I'm really pleased to see that. So I just wanted to give you a couple slides just to briefly summarize the morning part, the mayor's presentation, as a brief recap. So these are just a couple bullets in terms of takeaways or reminders for you. But obviously, small is big. Is the new big. Nonprofits are now really spearheading a lot of the decision-making and development in the city, and I would say a greater public-private partnership engagement, not only with nonprofits, but universities, wider community development groups, the private sector. We in Pittsburgh have been very lucky to have this wide coalition of partners actively engaged in the city's future. In decision-making, and that is a big credit to the mayor in forging this new alliance. The second point that he talked about is obviously the recent conference that we had, P4, that we spearheaded with a nonprofit, Heinz Foundation. And what came out of P4 was that we were very cognizant of just not listening to ourselves, but we invited a wealth of international experts and professionals to come and tell us their story. How did they make their cities great? Particularly from Scandinavia and our Nordic counterparts. And just to continue the conversation, the P4 principles now set a lot of our development and framing plans in the future. Some of the sites which you've seen yesterday afternoon are grounded on P4 principles and are part of the city's master planning process. The next thing is the Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment. And this is a newly created bureau that the mayor did, which really focuses on housing, small business, special initiatives that are related to immigrants, as well as new faith-based nonprofit groups as well. And so together, this Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment are really looking at the wider community and how best to engage them and put them into the city decision-making process as well. And so the mayor especially recruited an elite group of individuals that sit within the mayor's office to really reach out to the community for those wider engagement efforts. Next slide. And then I'll talk a little bit about the innovation roadmap later on in my PowerPoint or my presentation, but it's basically forging a new way for innovation in the city and what we're trying to do to drive technology, integration, sustainability, open data, and performance into a new level for the city. And finally, there's a really good quote from the mayor. He's a music buff. So that kind of summarizes the transformation of what we're trying to do in terms of where we were to where we need to be. And I think he highlighted a little bit not just the outcome of where we are right now, but the process in which it took us there. It wasn't easy. There were many challenges, and truth be told, there are still challenges, but we are working on addressing a lot of these tough questions and raising it to the table with a diverse group of stakeholders and partners. So thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
By the way, we're looking for somebody who would be willing to download a song from Duran Duran when Mayor Peduto comes in this afternoon to welcome him. So Steve, if you could do that and download, we'd appreciate it. We have a couple more slides. We're not going to do justice to our great panelists and to all the breakout sessions, but we did do our best to synthesize some of the notes that we took. And here are a quick summary of what we heard yesterday. Economic growth includes job and income and output growth. Opportunity is about the prospects that low-income individuals and families have to advance economically based on their own effort and ability. Inclusive economic growth is as much about sociology as economics. Polarization is on the rise, and it threatens our ability to sustain innovation. Inclusive economic growth is not about redistribution, it's about connecting growth and opportunity. We have to bridge the disconnect between the two different camps. We're dealing with the effects of an uneven economy, which makes this challenge even harder. The Fund for Our Economic Futures research shows that many metros had higher levels of poverty and inequality despite strong job growth. We have to focus on job creation, preparation, and access. Our choice, as Val Patton said, is to either be unintentionally exclusive or intentionally inclusive. As Aaron Flynn said, we have to make the business case for equity. Why is this in the self-interest of businesses? She noted that every strategic plan coming out of the Portland region focuses on social and economic equity. I should have said earlier that those entire first two slides were really taken from Brad Whitehead's presentation. Inclusion is not a separate economic practice. It's an intentional, integral part of every growth activity. I borrowed that from Bob Weisbord. Inclusion is not about checking the box. It must inform all decisions. It's embedded in the culture and the DNA of a community. We have to learn how to speak the languages of both growth and opportunity. And by the way, you'll notice now that I'm summarizing all the work that's done in the breakout sessions. While all of you were out at your tours or returning calls, our team was looking at all of your notes, trying to read your handwriting, and synthesizing all this into these slides. So we're doing the best we can. So all this stuff is what we heard during the course of those breakout sessions. That this is not just about jobs, it's about wealth creation. That this is a big challenge because it's not so much that we need new programs as it is we need a whole systemic change. Somebody suggested, I think I know who, but since I'm not positive, I won't say, somebody suggested that in addition to a best practices manual, that we create a worst practices manual. In other words, that we learn from our failures, and that the person in that breakout group said, for example, thinking about inclusion after neighborhood growth starts is usually too late. One table talked about how do we create a shared sense of destiny. That's not just a shared destiny with business, but also with our neighborhoods so that we all feel that we're in the same boat. Reaching out is different than engagement. So when you're reaching out to disinvested neighborhoods, it's not really the thing to do. Instead, you need to be where they are and engage and participate and empower and establish a sense of trust as opposed to checking off the box that we went to 2 meetings in that neighborhood. Creating incentives for the private sector to engage in inclusive economic growth is critical. We have to be patient. If something requires systemic change, it most likely is going to require patience for incremental progress. One group talked about the importance of scalability of small programs that work. More success is found when the focus is on specific neighborhoods rather than broad geographies. That's why the work of those of you who do regional work is so difficult, because there aren't obvious levers of power unless you have a regional government. So very often this is the better way to go. We need to legitimize and map multiple pathways to employment. While it was emphasized that a college degree, 2-year or 4-year, is very important, that we also have to recognize there are many other ways to acquire skills in this competitive job market. We have to address the labor market mismatch and focus on employer-driven training. We need to make sure that job mobility for low to moderate wage workers and access to middle income jobs is a key part of our strategy. The groups consistently talked about access to transportation, daycare, local food, and affordable housing as being instrumental to all of this, but doing it in a more strategic way. A great quote from one table was you can't go to work if you can't afford to go to work. Physical infrastructure creates pipelines to opportunity if you do it right. That includes whether it's an opportunity corridor in Cleveland or transit-oriented development. Sometimes success sometimes looks like gentrification that impedes trust. There's two sides of that gentrification coin, and sometimes it gets in the way of establishing a sense of trust. Critical importance of mixed income neighborhoods to make sure that you can bridge that growth and opportunity gap. Buying local came up at a lot of your tables. And one that we'll be hearing about, I know, from Ray Leach today during the last session, and one we heard about from a lot of your tables was very important to provide access to resources, not just financial resources, but mentoring resources for minority entrepreneurs. And then we went through and we looked at specific examples that all of you cited. And so what we'll be doing in our final report is get a little bit more information about your examples, and if we believe that they are relevant, and I'm sure they will be, we'll provide that information in the final report to you. But this was from all the different sheets. Those of you from those cities mentioned a particular program as an example of something that worked, or at least would be a good strategy in their city. So we at least wanted to get it down here so we knew we could follow up with all of you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our morning keynote speaker, somebody who is familiar to many of you and who is widely regarded internationally as a real star in this field. Toni Griffin is the founding director of the J. Max Bond Center on Design for the Just City at the Spitzer School of Architecture at the City College of New York, dedicated to the advancement of design practice and education and research and advocacy in ways that build and sustain resilient and just communities and cities and regions. Toni maintains an active private practice known as Urban Planning and Design for the American City, and many of you have heard her TED Talk where she talks about her work leading the Detroit Future City Project at the beginning that led to the Detroit Future City that Dave Egner and many others have worked on in Detroit since Toni led that process. Toni has held a number of public sector positions, including Director of the Community Development of Newark, New Jersey. She started her career at the great architectural firm of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, and has worked in DC and throughout the country in a variety of planning roles. But most importantly, Toni is a widely respected practitioner and thought leader in both areas. We're lucky to have her. Ladies and gentlemen, Toni Griffin.
Good morning. I'm going to set an obnoxious timer, although I'm not sure, do I have 10 minutes or 2 hours now, given that we're...
Look at that just in case. See that? The countdown.
Yeah. I can go till 0 or...
44 minutes and 48 seconds.
Oh, wow, cool. Okay. Great. Thank you again for having me, and I'll apologize. Since I spoke to an audience of CEOs, I think last year around exactly this time, so I apologize if I'm going to be redundant, but perhaps this is still an important message to communicate. You know, I think yesterday's roundtables, and I had the privilege to facilitate one of the tables, you know, the opening question that the team asked us to present was, what inspires you to make change? And that resonated with me because I feel like over the last year, I've been looking back at the career that I've had the good fortune of having that Lee summarized and reflecting on my work, not so much about what inspires me to make change, but have I made an impact? And because I am a designer, an architect, an urban designer at my core who kind of transitioned to playing an urban planner, I've been very curious about the role that design has on impacting these issues of inclusivity and equity, really, and challenging myself to not only look at the work that I've had the good fortune to be a part of in these different cities and wearing these different hats, but as I continue to practice both in the academy and through my own firm, what more impact can I be making? And that certainly seems to be what this workshop intends to do. So I'd like to just take you on the journey of my reflections through some slides that talk about my work. And I think, and I hope, I guess, that it will communicate some of the themes that have already surfaced in the first day of this conference. I think we've heard intentionality a lot, and I think that that's really critical. I think the thing to add on to that, that perhaps yesterday's small group discussions was getting at as well, was definition. So what do we mean when we say things like inclusive growth? And I think it certainly was very diverse at our table, and I think diverse around the room. But imagine if we were to ask that to the partners and folks on the ground that we're working with, and I wonder if their response would be anywhere close to ours. You know, people living the challenge of trying to find a way to get to work and find the job. What does inclusive growth mean to them? So this idea of language and definition I find really important. And so I've tried to use that as a little bit of part of the test of how I'm looking at my practice. So I'm going to start with this word equity, because in the design space, there's been a lot of conversation and a lot of movement around social impact design, designing for equity, and I've been asking myself, well, what does that really mean? Is it enough if we sort of take these frames and singularly align them around a single value? Are we excluding other values that have to be wrapped around that? What does design contribute to equity? Who participates in not only the definition of it, but the actual realization of it? And who benefits from these outcomes? So when I got the opportunity to start the J. Max Bond Center at the School of Architecture in New York, I put this tagline on it, Design for the Just City. And again, it was my way of beginning to figure out how my discipline, how my practice was contributing to this. And I don't know, when I heard the word and the term just and just city, it just really resonated with me. And I think it's appropriate in this time where we're looking at these issues of inclusivity or whatever, but surfacing are these issues of social justice and the relationship to space and economic development as we turn on the TV every day, and wanting to infuse a little bit of that in the conversation. So I'm interested in merging my academic and practice work around just outcomes, distributed justly, and through just processes. And so my practice is built on working with collaborations. I think that is essential towards this reshaping and rebuilding of not only place, but people. And what I'm trying to infuse in my work is this value-based approach to planning and design. So imagine if we start our work by ascribing a certain set of value aspirations that we're trying to achieve. Part of my work at the School of Architecture is I designed a graduate level seminar called Design for the Just City. The students are asked to create a manifesto of what they think the just city is. And we have a Vimeo channel called J. Max Bond Center, where there are 21 different manifesto videos that students have created over the last 4 years that are trying to put some meaning around what that vision is for the just city. And what's been interesting about that work is these are kind of some of the top 50 values that emerge when I ask folks to think about justice, social justice, equity, and cities. And any one of us can latch on to different ones that resonate. I think they're different given the community and the context that you're working in, but imagine if our work started by some shared set of values that we were trying to move to. So in my work, both in the center and my practice, I've decided to test 10 of them through some projects that we're doing, and also looking back at projects that I've done, and really trying to be intentional about what I mean when I use that term, meaning putting a definition to it, and then evaluating whether my work is moving towards that, or in new work, if I can develop strategies that move towards. I'm going to walk through some examples for each of the 10. So the first one is equity. I wasn't expecting the screen to be over there, so I can't read it. So I'm going to turn it this way. So let's start with the one we, is kind of out there all the time now, equity. We've defined this as the distribution of material and non-material goods in a manner that brings the greatest benefit to any particular community. And I like to use an example of the work that I've been doing in legacy cities. So there is a cohort of practitioners that have been working with a cohort of cities. These are cities we've defined as greater than 50,000 in population that have lost greater than 20% of their population since their peak. So I think a number of people in the room are in legacy cities, the Cleveland, Columbus, Toledo, Detroit, Milwaukee's. Pittsburgh actually falls into this category as well. And we wanted to focus on these cities because we really felt, given some of the sustained challenges that they've had around poverty, unemployment, population loss, loss of revenues, excessive portfolios of vacant land, that there were not only opportunities for innovative practice, but that practice needed to look different than it would perhaps in a strong market-driven economy. So through our work in Detroit Future City, we start with economic growth, not land use, because it was important for us to realize that the health of the city, irrespective of its geographic footprint or its population, was a function of the ratio of jobs to residents. So certainly, and the current mayor is a big proponent of growing the population of Detroit, but we also wanted to remind folks working on the ground there that the growth of jobs in the city was perhaps slightly more important than just the aggregate total of people working in the city. And so we had a very data-driven approach to this work, understanding that 61% of the population was commuting outside of the city to find jobs, not in the city, and that we were particularly interested in a city that is 82% African American, the race and economic state of that population, and businesses that were minority or African American owned, and how they were participating in the economy of the city. One of the things that was very important for us to realize is that Detroit is not only no longer a one-company town, but was also not a town that only had a single economic employment center. That in fact there were 7 places scattered throughout the city in different neighborhoods of the city that had strong and robust job centers in terms of total numbers of jobs, but also total numbers of businesses. And they were working in clusters that gave us this opportunity to really think about a place-based approach to economic development that would not only grow existing businesses, create opportunities to attract new businesses, and therefore create a total larger share of jobs, but also find ways to revitalize the community in which they sent. You can certainly see and have heard how the Midtown and downtown are beginning to grow, but we feel that there are 5 other places in the city where this kind of revitalization can take root. And this is an example of Corktown, for example, which was the home of the old Tiger Stadium, where we're finding a significant amount of entrepreneurial growth, both new and homegrown, that's growing up around this neighborhood. And with a particular attention to speaking and developing very intentional and specific strategies for growing existing Black-owned and minority-owned businesses, as well as creating new ones. And Teresa Lynch, who is a part of this conference, was one of the principal authors of some of these strategies, so you should seek her out and talk to her more about that agenda. Secondly is connectivity, linking people, places, and opportunities through physical and social networks. Our table certainly talked a lot about not only this physical infrastructure, but one of the things that keeps people excluded is this lack of social networking and connectivity to opportunity. In this case, I'm going to talk more about the physical connectivity through my work in Washington, D.C. This is the southeast waterfront, which a decade and a half ago was isolated by freeway. To the north there is the Toni Capitol Hill. There's the Capitol building here. And here we see this enclave of public housing, this enclave of utilities, and this larger enclave of federal properties. The idea was how to connect not only Capitol Hill to the amazing natural resource of the Anacostia River, but really connect those enclaves into more of a mixed use, mixed income neighborhood. Simple things like the need to reconnect and bring streets back to the waterfront so someone can actually walk to the edge of the water. Simple, obvious things, but we needed the intentionality to make that happen. And transforming what was about 700 units of public housing that looked like this through one of the last Hope 6 projects under the old frame of Hope 6 that actually did one-to-one public housing replacement on site, paired with an additional 800 units of affordable and market rate housing. This was through a public-private partnership of not only taking the lands that were owned by the housing authority, but also large tracts of privately owned land, bundling those together to really ensure that we could retain the connectivity of people who had established neighborhood with the opportunity to stay in that neighborhood. And this is just an image of how the mixed-use development is also growing up around that. Third value was access, convenient proximity to, quality presence of, and or connectivity to basic needs, amenities, choices, and decisions. And here's where it's important, again, to remember that we're talking about material and non-material ways to achieve these different values. Here we're back in the same neighborhood. One of the ways in which we wanted to create that access was the way in which we used the public land that we owned to create access to new public amenities. So these are 3 city-owned lots that we did an international design competition fund won by Portland's Catherine Gustafson to create what is now called Canal Park, which is this really interesting bridge between some of the commercial office space and that residential neighborhood that I showed you before. One of the things that was important for us to do in the process of designing the competition and selecting the architect is we had 3 neighborhood residents on our team making the decisions about who was going to design the park, how the park was going to be programmed, and to ensure that it wasn't going to be a park that was simply co-opted by all the daytime office workers, but that the person who had lived there for 30 years in public housing still felt very comfortable coming and appropriating that park for their types of use. The other way in which we're looking at access is by the reappropriation of a former highway bridge that crossed the Anacostia River that separated Capitol Hill from the lower income neighborhood of Anacostia through the new 11th Street Bridge Park, which was also an international competition won by Olin Partners that will hopefully be starting its design work this year. Huh, okay. I didn't do that, but maybe it's a signal. Okay, questions? Conversation? What went wrong with Cleveland? Let's talk about that for a second. Oh, give Cleveland people a hug if they're at your table. They're really kind of in shock. Well, I'm from Chicago, and so I've lived through some ups and downs of building dynasty, so hang in there. It'll work out for you. Huh? Oh, okay, hey, choice, okay. You know, this is a kind of oddball one to put out there, but I wanted to give it a try, which was the ability for any and all communities to make selections among a variety of options, places, programs, amenities, and decisions. And you see that I'm interjecting this process component to these values a lot. So it's not always about us trying to find strategies to produce a physical outcome or program. It is really about how you're allowing others to be a part of that decision-making table, and sometimes we don't get there because of the lack of choice that we have. So again, I'm going to land us back in Detroit Future City. Land use was obviously one of the big challenges to this work. What we ended up doing was creating what we call the framework zone map. It was important for us to understand how this land was, its current condition, and the pace with which it was changing. So the pinkish areas are the areas with the highest amount of vacancy. So we're talking 50, 60, 70, 80% vacant land. The areas in blue, shades of blue, are the areas with the least amount of vacancy, which in some cases could be upwards of 20%. Now, if you're from a strong market city, 20% is horrifying. So this represents that no neighborhood in Detroit, or all neighborhoods in Detroit, were vulnerable to the change in land condition. And so what we wanted to do, because there were these obvious fears of people being forced to move out of their neighborhood and therefore the city, it was important for us to start to begin to set the conversation around different choices of where you could live in the city, and how building off of those existing land conditions we can transition from a fairly typical city land use map, which only codes things by single uses. So all the yellow is predominantly single-family residential. You'll see very few red and purple spaces, and very few green spaces, in fact, to a new way of thinking about land use, which was based on neighborhood typologies. And so how every neighborhood or every area of the city had some opportunity to become productive again in some either traditional or existing way, or perhaps some new way. So you'll see that some of the areas that were formerly pink have become these different shades of blue, green, and pink, because we do think, in fact, that because no area is completely vacant, there's still actually homeowners in some of these spaces, that we needed to find new ways to create livability in some of those areas, even if they weren't going to be rebuilt back as traditional residential neighborhoods. And so, for example, one of the typologies we came up with was called live-make. It's spin on live-work, because we really wanted to honor the legacy of ingenuity and production that Detroit and so many of our Midwestern and legacy cities are built upon, and think about ways of real estate development and land use that really allowed and embraced and incentivized this co-production of neighborhoods, so industry and manufacturing and production adjacent to different forms of residential development, whether it was lots, adjacent lots, or actually within building structures. And we created in the Detroit Future City Framework these types of illustrations that really show the integration of people in place. So for example, this one talks about the ability to appropriate an old space, developing a program perhaps that's teaching young people how to repair bikes. But in addition to, and we heard a program about this yesterday, in addition to teaching them the skills of building the bike, you're also teaching them the skill of becoming a business owner. So now you've got a business owned by a young person or a person of color that is now creating revenue to perhaps buy a building in that neighborhood and become an owner in that neighborhood and contributing more to the cycle of revitalization that is embedded in people and place development. Another neighborhood of choice was green residential. This was recognizing that in those middle zone areas where you still had high populations of people and housing, but still had a pretty high volume of vacant land, and given that the market was not going to produce significantly more single-family residential, what else can we do with that land besides thinking about it as a residential park? And so we began thinking about ways of perhaps, in this example, as we're taking down abandoned buildings that are beyond repair, instead of just demolishing them and putting the materials in a hole, vis-a-vis the basement, that we can be doing more thoughtful deconstruction and recapturing of materials that can be used to develop additional and new types of facilities, uses within the neighborhood. Diversity, the acceptance of a mix of program, people, cultural norms. I think a lot of times we look at diversity programs and we put these quotas. I think there has to be this larger embrace that diversity has some value, other than being able to look out at your workforce and see that there are people of different colors and ages. There really has to be this embrace that there is a value add, economic and otherwise, to having diversity. So staying in Detroit, this is actually an image of the green space in Detroit. It's a mapping of the tree canopy from the late 90s, showing that the density of green things growing, particularly in the spaces of vacancy, is fairly dense, and you can see how that aligns with that framework zone map. And when we got there, the conversation around open space was either a traditional recreational ball field or park, or it was urban agriculture, urban gardening. And given the volume of vacant land in Detroit, which is equal to 20 square miles of land, which is roughly equivalent to the whole island of Manhattan, certainly rec fields and community gardens were not going to address the ways with which to recapture some of this land and put it into some productive use that was not within the typical sort of land market-based approach of development. So working with a fairly progressive team of landscape architects, thinking about the spectrum of productive land use that could occur, And one of the principal ways to do that was around thinking about blue and green infrastructure, adding this amazing value of, one, transitioning our gray infrastructure to green and multifunctional infrastructure that was obviously doing the function of perhaps stormwater management, but also creating this neighborhood amenity that can actually be used by neighborhood and community residents. And that was also, in a lot of cases, increasing the property values of adjacent lands because you've created this beautification amenity. And oh, you're not displacing anyone as 19th and 20th century infrastructure had typically done. So in this kind of complex diagram, we're showing how these different tactics of managing stormwater through swales, through surface lakes, through wetlands and other things really built into an urban context frame where there's still development around it could begin to transition us out of the antiquated and expensive gray infrastructure into systems that create all of those additional multifunctional benefits. So that you're then transitioning from a traditional land open space map that looks like these little spots of parks and ball fields to this open space diagram that is much more lush and integrated with development adjacent to it, and again, serving multiple functions. Participation, the active engagement of individuals and community members in matters affecting social and spatial well-being. And I think Lee pointed out one of the comments that came up. It's not about outreach and input. It is really about establishing this two-way conversation with folks that we're working with as a part of actually designing the programs themselves, in addition to getting input on the kinds of ideas that we think could be helpful. So just by one way of an example, and because a number of tables, and Lily Stars in particular, talked about the need of a multi-generational approach to the type of work we're doing, how we are bringing younger people and younger leaders into these conversations to continue this work. Certainly the need to use and incorporate more contemporary forms of engagement are essential. So here's a project we've done through Instagram called #JustCityOrNot, where we ask people to, through their experience of cities, photograph things that they think are just or unjust. And so we have this really cool catalog on Instagram of about 550 images that show examples of things people are just or not. And you put these comments on them and you engage this kind of dialogue around visualizing a sense of justice or injustice or any of these values. So for example, this is an image from Medellin, which was this really great activity where community members were appropriating the public space and putting their stamps on it as a way of creating this larger festival that was happening every weekend. And perhaps we can have endless debates around whether people feel that the notions of developing suburban-style development in the middle of Arizona is just or not. And the idea is to be provocative and create debate. And so this is this way of getting broader communities to participate in the awareness of these kinds of issues and ultimately inform solutions. Creative innovation is one that I'm trying out because I'm interested in examining this work through the lens of design. And so nurturing ingenuity and problem solving and intervention, and this came up at our table too, which is this need to not be afraid to try new things and to be disruptive. We're trying to address, when we're talking about the issues of inclusive growth, long-standing, systemic, institutionalized issues that have been living in these cities for decades, half a century in some cities. And so I think it's imperative that we try to be quite bold in the way in which we think about new ways to push past some of these deeply embedded issues. One way in which we tried that is I'm now landing us in Newark and looking at it through the lens of regulation. When I first started there as planning director, there was a team of a couple of planners that was trying to figure out a way to revise the city's infill housing zoning requirements. And it was a group of classically trained planners thinking about the guidelines that you find in zoning. And it was for these houses called Bayonne boxes. Is anyone from northern New Jersey and knows that term? Lots of smaller northern New Jersey cities don't have alley systems. And so you get these typical 25-foot lots that somehow people felt more suburban when they were built as standalone, as detached as opposed to attached. So you have them with these very narrow side lots. They had these insane parking requirements that required 1.5 cars per unit. So instead of having a front lawn, you essentially have an asphalt driveway because you've got to park sometimes up to 5 cars beyond the lot line. And they were fairly mass-produced, so you get the quality of the materials, the fenestration, and everything about them is, I'm an architect, so I'm going to say not that appealing. And so as an architect, you know, kind of masquerading as an urban planner, what I wanted to look at is whether these guidelines and zoning regulations were actually going to produce better quality neighborhoods, better quality houses, better quality units. And so I got 12 different architects to volunteer to take these guidelines and to design to them and tell me, were the guidelines achieving the larger values that we wanted? Was it making the neighborhood, the quality of the street, the quality of the house better? And were there things that we should incorporate or change in order to achieve that kind of goal? So I learned that Richard Meyer was actually born in Newark and lived there till the age of 3, so I called him, and he did it for us, as well as 12 other amazing architects and college schools of architecture. So this is the Richard Meyer design, where we had the example of looking at it on a commercial street. And one of the great things about this is they did illuminate really interesting and creative ways to take the standard form of regulation for infill housing and try to advance the way we could create low-income, affordable, market-rate housing in ways that would improve the overall physical quality of the neighborhood and types of units. And then we translated those into much more user-friendly, legible sets of guidelines that not only developers and landowners could use, but also communities could use as a part of the public process of approving projects through planning commission, et cetera. And then the last one is beauty. Everyone deserves beauty, and I think that's an underrated value that we don't talk about. And so everyone deserving the right to well-designed places and environments. And this is just a reminder that I started out as an architect. And so I think through everything I've done in this career that has me talking at conferences that are about inclusive economic growth, to talking about design, is that I come at this by thinking about the quality of space and how we use it. And I'm questioning now how this discipline and how the work that I do begins to impact these values and the challenges that I face in all the cities that I come to. So lastly, can we measure design's impact? So that's the latest thing that I've been exploring. And can we do that in ways that are really specific? And probably a number of you are dealing with sustainability indicator metrics and now our resiliency indicator metrics. So I wanted to see whether or not you can apply this sort of metrics frame to design. We've been working on a project with Gell Architects out of Copenhagen that was responsible for creating New York City's public plaza program. If you've been to New York and you've been through Times Square recently or the Flatiron District, you know it's about the appropriation of streets. Oop, that's my timer, I'm over. Okay. The appropriation of streets to create more public space for pedestrians, because when we looked at the density of cars versus the density of people and the ratio of space devoted to either of those, more space was devoted to cars, and obviously there were throngs of people who had this much space to work in. So the idea was to turn that upside down. So we wanted to see whether or not these plazas were actually having any impacts on social justice. There are 7 of them that we looked at. This is kind of how they look in terms of appropriating the streets for public space. We used desktop research, observational surveys, and intercept surveys. I think a lot of times we feel like we can sit at our desk and collect information and that'll give us a good snapshot of what's going on. Not when you're looking at these kinds of value-based approaches. You have got to talk to the people who are actually interacting and or benefiting from the work we're trying to do and get their take on what you're talking about. And perhaps have that change the questions you're asking because what we're asking and what they're living every day are sometimes miles apart. So the last couple of values out of the 10 one was looking at inclusion and belonging, which has become one of my favorite, the acceptance of difference and the intention to involve diverse opinions, attitudes, and behaviors. And so for the public space, we looked at the demographic of inclusion, how design was facilitating that, and we looked at it through the lens of public safety. We're just now beginning to collect some of the survey inputs. So for example, we asked people, has the plaza increased your sense of safety? So we have one plaza in the plaza in Manhattan, the meatpacking district, and a plaza in Queens. And the beige color is that it improves their safety greatly. The gray color is somewhat. And then we're looking at responses based on income, responses based on whether you live in the neighborhood or not, responses based on age and gender. Another thing we looked at, and I think that this is a critical one to think about that absolutely has to sort of insert itself in the frame of inclusive growth, which is ownership. The ability to have an equity stake in a process or outcome. And here for the public plazas, we looked at the overall composition of ownership in the neighborhood, the formal mechanisms of ownership of the public space, and the informal mechanisms of it. So here, and this may be hard to read, so through our survey mechanism, we asked people, we looked at their income levels in terms of who was using the plaza by income and by race, depending on the plaza. And I won't go through the specifics of this, but we were trying to understand who's using the plaza and who isn't. Who feels like it's their plaza in terms of, is this your plaza? This is a public space. Do you feel like you own this or not? And a lot of times you find these really interesting disconnects between, lower income people really do feel like it's theirs. People from out of town who use it don't feel like it's theirs because it's not my city. And some of these kinds of nuances I think are really important to helping us shape and look at the ways we are designing spaces, programming spaces, and being inclusive. We also looked at, we asked a question about, and I think we should change the question. We asked the people, if you saw a piece of trash, would you pick it up as a way of measuring stewardship? We should have asked, because the response was overwhelmingly yes. And I think if someone's standing in front of you and said, would you pick up that piece of trash? You're going to say yes, because you don't want to look like, I won't do that. We should have asked, have you ever picked up a piece of trash? But again, understanding whether or not, based on that sense of ownership, do you feel therefore inclined to go to the next step to actually engage in being a part of keeping it intact. My whole point of this is I think that there are these multiple layers and ways by which we have to grab information and dissect it to be inclusive, to be just, to be equitable. So my frame is, when equity isn't enough, design for the just city. Thank you.
We have microphones strategically placed around the room. So raise your hand and somebody will rush over to you with a mic, and just stand and identify yourself and your city, please.
Thank you. From Columbus, Ohio. In the Intercept surveys and the public spaces created, what were some of the surprises that you encountered in looking at the results?
Well, we're just grabbing the information, which is voluminous, and trying to unpack it. So let me try to think and see what some of the things were. Well, there's one neighborhood in Queens that is predominantly Hispanic, but also has a fairly large and growing Asian population. And what we found is the ratio of people using the plaza by race for Hispanics mirrored the composition of the neighborhood, but for Asians did not. So the use of the plaza by Asians was well under being representative of the larger population. And so in that case, one of the things we want to understand, well, is there something that is not having those folks feel a sense of inclusion and belonging or ownership? So we then had to go out and look at what was happening in or around the plaza, and what we noticed, and it's obvious, but until you ask the right questions, maybe not so much, is that most of the shops cater to Hispanic populations. So there was this disconnect of Asians perhaps not feeling, as these populations can be culturally specific in terms of their goods and services, didn't necessarily maybe find a reason to have to be there. So on the back end, because we want this tool to not only give us the snapshot of current performance, we want us to help inform how you would, if inclusion and belonging was a goal, how do you begin to correct that? perhaps there are ways of either thinking about programming for the plaza that tries to attract greater diversity of population to it and addresses that sense of belonging. How is the Asian community involved in the design and programming in terms of the management structure of the plaza itself? How could there be more outreach to have them be a part of shaping what happens in the plaza? So that would be one example of something we found.
Other questions? Right out there.
I'm Shaka Zakarian. I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I have a question about your process. So as community developers, I think that we often struggle with the outsider's perspective. How do you come into a community as people who aren't part of it and building equity? I think oftentimes that trust is so important, but in our experience in our community development projects, this year our focus has been on building equity in part of town that doesn't have it. And we really have been struggling with building that trust. There's a lot of skepticism. So what is your process or tips for kind of navigating the perception that outsiders are coming in to change something that maybe the community doesn't exactly understand?
Yeah, sure. A couple of responses. One is this metric tool, while we tested it in a fairly top-down way in that we picked the 10 values and we ascribed the metrics, the idea when we developed this further as a plausible neighborhood tool that neighborhoods and communities and cities could use is that the community itself would ascribe the values that are most important to them. So I think part of overcoming that is allowing them to sort of set the overarching frame of what the aspirations and outcomes should be achieving. And so that's what we hope to move this to. I think the second thing is about this intentionality when you are coming from the outside as either a consultant or an organization that is maybe based there but doesn't look anything like the neighborhood you're serving, is how you upfront include some of those folks on the team that's designing what the engagement is, right? So that you're not standing in front of the community talking. The person from the community is standing in front of the community talking to their neighbors and talking to the community so that the trust is seen, is viewed by and felt by the community, seeing that you have in fact found folks that are of us as part of the structure you've set up to even decide how we're going about doing this or what we're going to do. And this was a big turning point for us in the Detroit Future City work around our civic engagement approach. We moved to a model that incorporated what we called process leaders. And so what that was hiring 6 local organizations, and they all weren't community-based nonprofit. It was across all the different sectors of the community broadly. And they worked with us to design, interpret the data, to figure out the different tactics of engagement that we would do. And then through various people on their staffs and other community volunteers that we paid, so I shouldn't call them volunteers, they led the engagement. So while our team of technical consultants may have been there, we weren't always the people standing in front of the room having the conversations. We worked with our partners to develop tools, develop language, build their capacity to talk about these fairly complex issues with their neighbors in a way that engendered a lot of trust. So one of the great turning points, when we first started was this great fear that outsiders and white folks from the suburbs were coming to take over the land in the city. And there was this turning point where I remember someone stood up and said something about they're going to take my house, and so what, I live in this neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of, it has a lot of vacancy, but I still live there and it matters. And then someone from another part of town said, well, my water bills and stuff are really high. And it's because there's so much vacant land, we're subsidizing the cost of maintaining the infrastructure that's running as if the city were still 1.8 million people when it's actually 7. And I can't afford to do that anymore, so we really have to do something different. So on the one hand, you get this one person going, government needs to help me in the same way it already does, and this other person saying, well, you know what, we can't do that. anymore. And if you're tired of that vacant lot next to you, you need to get your neighbors together like we did and clean it up or fix it. So this shift around people beginning to talk to one another in a way that was facilitated by people guiding the conversation that were of them was transformative in the way. And so by the end of the process, over 160,000 people out of a population of 700 engaged in the work that we were doing. And I think one of the great success stories that I found with that is the continued way that shaped the civic engagement capacity in the city beyond the completion of the plan. So I believe there were, and there are a couple people from Detroit, and for some reason Dave Egner is in my eye shot, there were at least 4 or 5 different people, younger people, who had participated through that process that ran for city council seats as first-time elected officials, and I think maybe one of them won, but that was super gratifying that parts of this constituency are now trying to move into the formal places of decision-making, and I think at least 2 or 3 of them were actually urban planners, so thumbs up for urban planning. So I think those are a couple of the ways you try to overcome that.
We have time for 2 final questions. We'll go to Mac, and then I'll let somebody else decide. Go ahead, Mac, go ahead. Right here. Rush to Mac Pearsall.
He looks like he has a booming voice. Go for it.
I'm Mac Pearsall from Asheville. We're certainly not a legacy city. My question is about the resources to make this revitalization happen. The government resources locally aren't there because that's sort of a doom loop. The attitude in Washington in terms of city bankruptcies and allowing industries to go under, like they would have allowed the automobile industry to go under, suggests a high degree of indifference. So I'm wondering how you see the overall context for private dollars being induced to go into cities like that. Is it going to be through some sort of a tax process that will allow them to get in there? How are you going to get the private resources to really bring this revitalization off?
Yeah, I think the next 2 panels are chock-a-block full of people who will probably enlighten some of that response. And I think it's going to be different for every city. I will say, just based on the handful of cities that I've worked in, and it's why I've built my practice to work with groups in partnership as opposed to single sector clients. Because given the context that you just laid out, a multi-sector leadership, this kind of distributed leadership approach around leading these efforts, but also implementing these efforts seems to be just essential to do that. And this kind of notion of corporate citizenry is key in a really participatory ways. So obviously you've seen the impacts of both private corporate investment and philanthropic investment really helping to propel Detroit out of a bankruptcy that, quite frankly, people felt like was going to be the end of the day for the city. I think it's bolstered by the fact that you have this shared framework that brought people together for that type of partnership model to work towards, that has given those sectors the confidence to invest. So the way in which we can find that corporate citizenry to ignite the investment we have seen begins to attract the investment from outside, vis-a-vis, either having the federal government, as they did with Detroit, reprogram dollars that they gave to the city to be able to use in more effective ways, by the ways in which you're seeing various scales of private capital begin to come into the city because they've seen Dan Gilbert make these substantial investments, who is locally based, seems to be a trend that I'm finding with some of these cities that are starting to turn the corner. So multi-sector investment, that investment perhaps starting locally as a way of signaling a confidence for outside investors, both public and private, to follow suit.
We have 2 more questions, Jennifer Coleman and then Ned Hill, and those will be the final 2.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Coleman from
Hi.
Cleveland. And I had a question about one of your pillars, the creative innovation, and alleviating that fear of making a mistake. How does that get baked into the process of putting together new urban designs and getting communities to accept that, especially in legacy cities where mistakes are made and people just want to shut down the process because it's looking like it's going in a different way. Is tactical urbanism and trying maybe temporary installations to let people understand and make the adjustments, is that something that you've experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly happening a lot, in particular in legacy cities, and is having different kinds of impacts. I think where that conversation and where those investments need to go is to begin to really evaluate their ability to be replicated or scaled up, so that they're not just these temporal events that happen for a short period of time, but we actually try to figure out whether there are ways for those different types of experiments to lead towards more longer-standing, long-term change. And so I'd like to see how that work begins to inform us about making those investments that become more lasting and long-standing, and I do think that is important. I'll also say that I think it's important to begin to understand design not just as a discipline to produce outcomes of strategy and policy, but design as policy. So the reason why I use the regulation was a way of how we did that in partnership with our Economic Development Office as a way of helping them to think about how they were going to go about the disposition of infill lots in a way that was going to help produce higher property values and eliminate blight within certain neighborhoods. So pairing the economic and land disposition strategy with the way in which we wanted the quality of that development to occur, we thought was an economic proposition. So I'm a big proponent of design students that I meet and getting them to think about not only thinking about going off and being a starchitect and working at a cool design firm, but to actually spend some time in the public sector or in nonprofit organizations using those skills and that creative ingenuity to actually inform the kind of policy that we're all working on collectively. Mr. Hill.
Hey, Toni, this is more of a comment than
oh, good.
Than
you can have the last
question.
word.
So get you off the hook. As I was looking at what you did and have been observing the practice you're part of, practitioners sometimes see, here are 10 goals, and they're trying to make sense out of it. And what was really clear with what you've had here and what you've been doing is you can take the way in which you're thinking about community design and community development and just map it straight onto Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if you start with safety and then kind of going up to self-actualization, it's a way of taking the way of these, many different goals and say, how do we build on it? And I think particularly for practitioners, the notion that we need safe spaces first, then we need productive spaces, then we need spaces which lead to self-actualization and civic engagement. And the way you talked about the Mexican-Chinese issue in New York around one park brings that back. So that's just one thing that may help folks here to think that these just aren't scattershot, they build. Second comment was the way in which you were measuring safety. So you had it all as change. Well, the real important question is, do you feel safe? Then do you feel safer? So it's just a way of possibly for your group of thinking about this. It's far from random, not purely design, but it does meet to human needs and aspiration.
Yeah, this is the first time we've experimented with taking this collection of metrics and seeing, and we've learned so much, not only about what we learned, but probably more about what we didn't learn and how to finesse and nuance these questions. It's really been a fascinating exercise that we hope to build on and hopefully create a useful tool for. So thank you.
Please join me in thanking Toni Griffin.
Thank you. You're welcome.